They wrote in books that tell us what books they thought were important. I'd like to see more underlining of what parts of books they thought were important, but we don't get that far. But it's very, and then the letters. I don't think there's there must just be very few historical sites that can actually go through the letters and actually say, okay, I know when they bought this carriage, I know how much they paid for it, I know Julia used her tobacco money. Also, women's history. I don't think you get women's history anywhere else that you get it here. That Julia did take part in sitting up with the sick like most women, but she also bartered with people, business-like bartering. But while she did it, she had to call in male neighbors to help her out because she didn't look like a business person and people didn't trust her as a business person always. So there's awful lot of interesting things here. How people felt about death. Which you don't get in a lot of places. I went to one place in Louisiana where they do emphasize mourning, but they don't know exactly how the family, felt about death. And here you have James with his spiritualism. We have a letter from Sally saying suicide isn't really such a big deal, that people make it. There's a very romantic kind of notion about death here. Julia would go up and sit on the wall of the graveyard and watch the sunset and think about some of her ancestors who were buried in the graveyard. It was just a part of them. Death was really a part of them, where today we're so disconnected with things like that.
Well, they took care of their own dead too.
Yes, they were there. They even when Nancy Magruder died, Julia wrote a 2-page letter about how she dressed Nancy in the clothes that Nancy had picked out for herself, how she fixed her hair, put a bandana on her, and said Nancy would be very proud of the job we did, making her look like she used to. So they really did. They took care in death and in life. When people come to visit here, one of the neatest things that they say, and I've heard this a couple of times, is, my gosh, I never knew there was anything like this out here. And one man, I said, oh, well, we are kind of hidden out here. And one man said, well, I read about it a little bit in the newspaper, but it doesn't give you any of the idea of what you actually see when you come out. And I think it is hard to put in a little advertisement exactly what you see when you come out here. But people act like they're actually, when they walk through the door of the Dinsmore house, they're actually walking back into history. Because you have the smell, you have the sight. We don't have the sound yet, but everything, most of your senses, there's some things that, we can pick up the stereoscope, and children and adults like to look at that and see the old pictures that they would have played with when they were young. We play the little music box that Patty received when she was 2 years old in 1863. I guess that's one sound we get. So there are certain things, you just fill your senses with things from the past, and people do really enjoy that. I think also another thing that we do to help people experience that is most of the volunteers really do keep up reading the letters. So as you go through a tour in the Dinsmore house, you get little quotes and daily things that happen to people that you wouldn't get other places, and people really respond to that. These were human people. We used to, when I started here, on the tour, we would talk about how good they were. And as we started reading more and more letters, it's like, okay, but they had slaves, and you can't just say they were good slave owners. So we started changing things. We found out Patty had a drinking problem, and we started adding that to the tour, and it makes them much more human. Julia talked about the unbred, or poorly bred people that worked for, the coarse people that she had to hang around. And those were taken out. Those parts of quotes were taken out when I started here. But we started putting them back in and talking about, okay, they felt, they were definitely above a lot of people, a lot of their neighbors. But their neighbors, in turn, it seems, kind of laughed at James Dinsmore. Isabella wrote a letter that they were out on a sleigh ride, and the sleigh got stuck, and all the neighbors were laughing and yelling for Squire Dinsmore. And so I think James was seen as kind of an eccentric older man. But it's kind of interesting. It's more interesting to see a real family than it is to see or hear about a perfect family. So I think when people come out here, what they hear about is not just the people who worked for the Dinsmore who were imperfect, but also the Dinsmore family who was imperfect. And that's kind of fun.
The Dinsmore homestead is more than the personal histories. There is also the natural and geological uniqueness of the hills and valleys of Boone County.
Well, Dinsmore is a state nature preserve, which means that it primarily is protected by the state of Kentucky, but people can, of course, visit the nature preserve, but there are certain rules and regulations. In other words, it's not going to be abused, no cutting, no hunting, those kinds of things. And so, it pretty much is not what it did look like, but what it is now. In other words, it hasn't changed that much, but it has changed some. And a nature preserve or a state nature preserve, hopefully that would be the finest examples to show something about the geology, the biota, in other words, the plants, the animals, that would give a good representation of what it may have been like and what it is now. We have, out of that 500 or 600 acres, I think there's probably 300 acres or so that's been preserved. So almost the entire area. And I think you can see how private conservation groups or private historical groups, how local government, how the national or international organizations such as the Nature Conservancy and state organizations such as the state nature preserves, when they all work together, you wind up with something really good. Some people start in the house and then go outside. I started on the outside and then went in the house. And I thought, gosh, this place needs to be preserved. And so eventually, several of us, 6 of us, got together and we formed a foundation and bought it. And before that, I was with the Nature Conservancy and got the woods behind the house, 107 acres, preserved. And also, I had one of my former students do his master's thesis there. And in 1974, that was the year of the tornadoes went through this area. And so they popped through, and one of them went through, hit the chimney at the Dinsmore house, and then kind of bounced, kind of like a rubber ball bouncing across those slopes out there. And so he had his study all set up, and I had to call him. He was down at Bowling Green at Western Kentucky University. And I called him. I told him, I said, Mike, the tornado has hit some of your woods. And he thought, his woods ruined his whole thesis. I said, no, it probably made it better, because I said, now you're studying a natural disaster or a natural disturbance, and you can follow it up. So every 10 years from that time, so we've gone through 30 years of every 10 years going back and restudying the forest to see how it's recovered. First of all, it was an old woods. It was pretty much a large woods, like I said, 107 acres. And one of the things that not only did you find the unique woods, the forest, but you also had the geology. Most of western Boone County is unique. It's unique in the state of Kentucky because of the glaciers, because of the glacial impact. You can look at moraines. Again, this is where the glacier stopped and they washed in material. And so you can see pretty much that whole hill at Dinsmore is pretty much like a glacial moraine. And so it was left alone for a long, long time, so it forested. And I just tell them it's a good place to go back from a scientific standpoint and be able to look at that geology from the Nebraskan, which we can't see as much, but the Illinoisan and the Kansan. And if we want to see sort of in between, we can go up to the Boone County Cliffs and see excellent examples of Kansan conglomerate cliffs. Or we can go to Wilper Creek, a little north of this, of Dinsmore, and we can get to the Illinois Glacier. So you're right between the two. So it's really a unique spot. Kenton has a little bit of glacial material, and Campbell has a little bit of glacial material over around Mentor. But when you have more of it in Boone County, a larger area of glacial material. The rest of it is very, I guess you'd say, skimpy, not very much of it, but they have some large deposits, and there are lots of cliffs in Boone County. So that sort of, people knew it was something different. And not only when you had that glacial material, but it also, that led to underground aquifers and springs, and anybody that had a farm back in the back in the 1800s, early 1800s, they needed a place for safe, clean water. Finding the woods and finding the interesting geology with the glacial deposits and so forth, that made it even more interesting. And another key thing, and one of the things that attracted even James Dinsmore when he eventually came through in the 1830s, and it became attracted to the area, is that he was interested in vineyards, perhaps growing grapes. And this looked very much like what he called the Rhine country of Germany to him, kind of hilly, and the soil, because of that glacial material, a lot of it is very sandy. So that sandy soil was excellent for growing grapes. And James Dinsmore, they looked at things from a scientific standpoint. They were looking at scientific agriculture. So if they thought, well, I think we'll look about raising a particular kind of apple, well, they got a book on it and read about it and how to grow that apple. Or if they're raising a particular kind of sheep, they became experts on how you raise those particular types of sheep. So, and beekeeping, books on beekeeping. So one of the neat things is once you're even on the farm and you're up in the woods or you're in areas, you can go back to the house and find out what they tried to do. I think you'll notice the fact that you won't find stumps. It wasn't logged heavily or anything like that. As I mentioned, the lower slopes were cleared and the upper slopes were cleared, but the ridge tops were cleared. But all that was on the slopes, they were really too steep to farm, and so they left them alone. They probably grazed some of their animals in there, and that grazing would have removed some of the young seedlings and so forth. They would have eliminated some of those kinds of things, but it wasn't so heavily grazed that it lost its integrity. So the forest was in an excellent shape, and it was maintained like that for 100 and some years. The land was there long before Dinsmore, and then once you start up the trails behind the house, you begin to see the diversity of trees. You begin to see where man has had an influence, also with the cemetery on one of the top of the little slope. And then you'd begin to see throughout the forest, you'd find some white oak, some chinkapin oak, you'd find lots of sugar maples, lots of several tulip poplars along the edges. You'll find a lot of ash, slippery elm, basswood, just a diversity of trees. As I mentioned to you before, it was originally called Cherry Hill because there were some black cherries along the edge where they had cleared it initially. I mentioned portions that they cleared, and that's where you'd find most of your tulip poplar and your black cherries. So they would be there. And I think the good thing about that forest is that you also have a wonderful wildflower diversity. I think you also have the redback salamanders, which only occur in Kentucky and northern Kentucky, the northern 3 counties. And so it's just got a very interesting, I'd say, a farming history, a natural history. I think you can find some of the geologic glacial boulders and so forth there. So it's an interesting place. Well, the spring, of course, that's my favorite season, and so I always think it's the best. Very diverse. You have just about every spring wildflower you'll find in northern Kentucky there. You find a few unusual plants even as you go into the spring and into the summer. We have several orchids. We have several, and then we get into the fall. And even in the fall, you can even, some of the old pastures and pasture lands, they begin to show the colors and so forth. There'll lots of asters and goldenrod and more plants that you might find that have been more influenced by man. In other words, because of his changing the environment. So you have a seasonal type thing. You can see things every season of the year. In the future, I would hope it would become an area for people to visit, to look at the past. Certainly a place for school groups from an educational standpoint. I think it would be also an area that points out the geology that's unique for western Boone County, the forest that will probably become one of the remaining few forests we're going to have in this heavily populated northern Kentucky area. And so I think if we look at it, we can learn from Dinsmore. It's probably the best preserved example of one family's life and their life on the land in northern Kentucky. So if you really want to see how one family lived, you can certainly get it from viewing the materials in the house, the artifacts in the house, the history in the house, and then you can see the environment that they lived in, which was a forested, hilly, not the best land, but a unique type of land, a land that they were looking for at that particular time. But I think the main thing we could find about the Dinsmores is that they never were really successful. If they had become successful and become very rich, they may have left. The fact that they had problems, that they had to scratch out a living in many ways, but they were much more sophisticated, a little bit higher, we'll say money-wise, than most of the people in western Boone County. But they certainly had an interesting life there.
The Dinsmore Homestead Foundation history, preservation, and natural history are very important.
Dinsmore Homestead Foundation and the site is important to the region because of its uniqueness. Probably very few like this in the United States. It's important to the region because it provides an opportunity not only for the school children in the area, but for adults to come and learn something that they wouldn't find anywhere else. It's important for the region because it has benefit as a tourist attraction, and we have a lot of those. And it's important to the region because it gives people a sense of ownership in something that they can be proud of and they can participate. Because we couldn't operate without volunteers. And most of the people who are volunteers naturally come from the surrounding area. I think it's kind of summed up in one of the school children who left here one day. She kept lingering and the teacher kept saying, "Come on, get on the bus." And she turned around and she says, "I don't want to leave here. I just want to stay."